Good day everyone, I am Jonalyn Lina and for today I am going to discuss about the topic gendering desire. Nowhere in our intimate lives is there greater expression of gender difference than in our sexual relationships. She may make love just like a woman, as Bob Dylan famously sang, but he would make love just like a man. Though we often think that sexual orientation is the great dividing line in our sexual expression, if one is gay or straight, one knows all one needs to know about their sexualities, the evidence points decidedly the other way, toward an understanding that gender, not sexual orientation, is the dividing line along which sexual expression, desire, and experience is organized. In that sense, sexually speaking, gay, men, and lesbians are gender conformists. There are of course some signs of change. Women are reconstructing the traditional view of female sexuality as passive and receptive. The fertile combination of feminism, technological and medical breakthroughs, and general cultural transition. Sexuality has become increasingly masculinized. Masculinization of sex, including the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake, the increased attention to orgasm, the multiplication of sexual partners, the universal interest in sexual experimentation, and the separation of sexual behavior from love is partly a result of the technological transformation of sexuality from birth control to the internet, and partly a result of the sexual revolution's promise of greater sexual freedom with fewer emotional and physical consequences. Additionally, sexual revolution was a rejection of the Victorian double standard. Sex was invariably seen as bad for women, unhealthy, and immoral, while it was tolerated or even encouraged for men. The majority of women are not much troubled with sexual feelings of any kind, wrote by one physician, obviously male, in the 1890s. Kinsey believed that males and females have basically the same physical responses, though men are more influenced by psychological factors. Note that in the passage above, how Kinsey suggests that the advice of experts actually creates much of the difference between men and women. One study of gynecology textbooks published between 1943 and 1972 bears this out. The authors found that many textbooks asserted that women could not experience orgasm during intercourse. One textbook writer observed sexual pleasure is entirely secondary or even absent in women. Another described women's almost universal frigidity. Given such assumptions, it's not surprising that women were consoled to fake orgasm. After all, they weren't capable of real ones. It is good advice to the women the advantage of innocent simulations of sex responsiveness, because as a matter of fact, many women in their desire to please their husbands learn the advantage of such innocent deception. Was the one way one text consoled gynecologists to raise the issue with their female patients. The double standard persists today, perhaps less in what we actually do and what more in the way we think about sex. According to the sociologist Lilian Rubin, men still stand to gain status and women to lose it from sexual experience. He's a stud who scores, he's a slut who gives it up. Boys are taught to try to get sex, girls are taught strategies to foil the boys' attempts. Women are raised to believe that to be sexually active or promiscuous is to transgress the rules of femininity. These rules are enforced not just by men, of course, but also by other women and institutionalized by church, state, and school. The pursuit of sex transforms good girls into bad girls, so most women accept the cultural standard of sexual minimalism. Few partners, fewer positions, less pleasure, less sex without emotional commitment. Intercourse and orgasm are more important forms of sexual expression for men than they are for women. This leads to a greater emphasis on the genitals as the single most important erogenous zone for men. If men's sexuality is phallocentric, revolving around the glorification and gratification of the penis, then it is not surprising that men often develop elaborate relationships with their genitals. So when they think about sex, men and women are often thinking about different things. Actually, thinking about sex at all seems to be a gendered activity. Men tend to think about sex more than women. Over half of the men surveyed result in 54% in the most recent large-scale sex survey conducted by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago reported that they think about sex very frequently, compared with 19% of the women. Two-thirds of the women report that they think about sex less frequently, compared with 43% of the men. And 14% of the women say they rarely or never think about sex, compared with only 4% of the men. 40 years earlier, Alfred Kinsey and his colleagues had found that 89% of men who masturbated fantasized, while only 64% of women did. And what they use for their fantasies differs. Today, nearly one-fourth, 23% of men and 11% of women use X-rated movies or videos. 16% of men and 4% of women use sexually explicit books or magazines. And what they fantasize about differs dramatically. A research assistant have collected over 1,000 sexual fantasies from students over the past decade. In those fantasies, definite gender patterns emerge. Men tend to fantasize about strangers often more than one at a time, doing a variety of well-scripted sexual acts, and women tend to fantasize about setting the right mood of lovemaking with their boyfriend or husband, but rarely visualize specific behaviors. Men's fantasies are idealized renditions of masculine sexual scripts. First, genetically focused. Second, orgasm-centered, and last, explicit in the spatial and temporal sequencing of sexual behaviors. Thus, we might say that women's sexual imaginations are impoverished at the expense of highly developed sensual imaginations. By contrast, men's sensual imaginations are impoverished by their highly developed sexual imaginations. These differences hold for both heterosexual and homosexual women and men. While there has been some evidence of shifts in women's fantasies toward more sexually explicit scenes and increasing comfort with explicit language. Where do these dramatically different mental landscapes come from? One place, of course, is sexual representation. Pornography occupies a special place in the development of men's sexuality. Nearly all men confess to having some exposure to pornography, at least as adolescents. Indeed, for many men, the first naked. While the right-wing's efforts rehearsed America's discomfort with all things sexual, the radical feminist critic of pornography transformed the political debate, arguing that when men look at pornographic images of naked women, they were actually participating in a culture-wide hatred and contempt for women. Pornographic images are about the subordination of women. Pornography makes sexism sexy, in the words of one activist. Women they see are in pornographic magazines. Pornography also exaggerates the masculinations of sex. Which gender's sexuality does that sound like? As a result, as anti-pornography activist Jan Stoltenberg writes, pornography tells lies about women, but it tells the truth about men. Closing the sexual gender gap. Despite the persistence of gender differences in sexual attitudes and behaviors, the sexual gender gap has been closing in recent years, as women's and men's sexual experiences come to more closely resemble one another's, or rather women's experiences have come to resemble men's. As I argued earlier, our experience of love has been feminized and our sexuality has been increasingly masculinized. While men's sexual behavior has hardly changed, women's sexuality has changed dramatically, moving increasingly closer to the behavior of men. Part of this transformation has been the result of the technological breakthroughs and ideological shifts that have come to be known as the sexual revolution. Now, let's talk about feminism. Ideologically, feminism made the pursuit of sexual pleasure, the expression of women's sexual autonomy, a political goal. Once, feminists exposed what one feminist called the myth of the vaginal orgasm. Feminism was thus, in part, a political resistance to what we might call the socialized asexuality of feminine sexuality. Part of my attraction to feminism involved the right to be a sexual person, recalls one woman. Another envisioned a feminism that validates the right for a woman to say yes instead of no. Rates and motivation for masturbation have also begun to converge. What, after all, is masturbation but self-pleasuring, surely an expression of sexual agency? The most recent large-scale national sex survey found that men's and women's motivations for masturbation were roughly similar. Homosexuality as gender conformity. There are a lot of evidence that homosexuality is deeply gendered, and that gay, men, and lesbians are true gender conformists. To accept such a proposition leads to some unlikely alliances, with gay affirmative writers and feminists lining up on the same side as an ultra-conservative writer like George Gilder, who in his unwavering critique of masculinity, both gay and straight, writes that lesbianism has nothing whatever to do with male homosexuality. Just as males homosexual with their compulsive lust and promiscuous impulses offer a kind of caricature of typical male sexuality, lesbians closely resemble other women in their desire for intimate and monogamous coupling. During the early waves of the women's movement, lesbianism was seen as a political alternative, a decision not to give aid and comfort to the enemy. How could a woman be truly feminist, they asked, if she shared her life and bed with a man? The political lesbian represented a particular fusion of sexual and gender politics, and an active choice that matched one's political commitment. For a woman to be a lesbian in a male supremacist, capitalist, misogynist, racist, homophobic, imperialist culture, wrote one woman, is an act of resistance. While of course not all lesbians are feminists, even this construct of political lesbianism is a form of gender conformity. If one resists gender inequality, political lesbians argue, then one must opt out of sexual relationship with men and choose to be sexual only with women because they are women. Gender remains the organizing principle of sexuality, even a sexuality that is understood as a form of resistance to gender politics. We know how homophobia constructs gay experience, but we are less aware of the power of homophobia to structure the experiences and identities of heterosexuals. Homophobia is more than the fear or hatred of homosexual. It is also for men the fear of being perceived as unmanly, effeminate, or worst of all, gay. These fears seem less keen among heterosexual women, though many worry about the dangers of homosexuals to their children. Male heterosexuals often spend a significant amount of time and energy in masculine display so that no one could possibly to get wrong impression about them. In one study, many heterosexual men said they had sex in order to prove they weren't gay. Since our popular misperception about homosexuality usually centered on gender inversion, compensatory behaviors by heterosexual often involve exaggerated versions of gender stereotypic behaviors. In this way, homophobia reinforces the gender of sex, keeping men acting hyper-masculine and women acting ultra-feminine. Heterosexuality as currently construed and enacted, the heroic preference for other gender, requires homophobia, right sex researchers John Gagnon and Stuart Michaels. With the onset of the HIV epidemic, major changes occurred in the sexual patterns of gay men, including fewer partners, less anonymous sex, and increases in the practice of safer sex and the number of gay male couples. The emphasis on safer sex was seen by many as an effort to feminize sexuality. To return it to the context of emotional and monogamous relationship, thus abandoning the earlier gay liberationist ethic of sexual freedom. AIDS remains a highly gendered disease. Although women and men are both able to contract the virus that causes AIDS, in fact, women are actually more likely to contract the virus unprotected heterosexual intercourse than are men. And despite the fact that the rates of new infection among women are increasing faster than among men, the overwhelming majority, over 80% of all AIDS patients in the United States are men. AIDS is the most highly gendered disease in American history, a disease that both women and men could get, but one that overwhelmingly disproportionately affects one gender and not the other. It would be useful to understand masculinity, risk-taking, avoidance of responsibility, pursuit of sex above all other ends as a risk factor in the spread of the disease in the same way that we understand it to be a risk factor in drunk driving accidents. Next topic is what else affects sexuality. While gender remains one of the organizing principles of sexuality, other aspects of our lives also profoundly influence our sexual behaviors and expectations. For one thing, sexual behavior, as we've seen, varies widely among different cultures. Margaret Mead found that in some cultures, the idea of spontaneous sex is not encouraged for either men and women. Among the Arabes, she writes the exceptions are believed to occur in women. Parents warn their sons even more than they warn their daughters against permitting themselves to get into situations in which someone can make love to them. Another anthropologist reported that in one Southwest Pacific society, sexual intercourse is seen as highly pleasurable and deprivation as harmful to both sexes. And Bronislaw Malinowski saw significant convergence between women and men in the Trobriand Islands, where women initiate sex as often as men, and where couples avoid the missionary position because the women's movements are hampered by the weight of the man so that she cannot be fully active. In the contemporary United States, several variables other than gender affect sexuality, such as class, age, education, marital status, religion, race, and ethnicity. Take class, for example. Kinsey found that contrary to the American ideology that holds that working class people are more sensual because they are closer to their animal natures, lower class position did not mean hotter sex. In fact, he found that upper and middle class people were more sophisticated in the arts of love, demonstrating wider variety of activities and greater emphasis on foreplay, while lower class people would dispense with preliminaries and did not even kiss very much. There is evidence that race and ethnicity also produce some variations in sexual behavior. For example, blacks seems to hold somewhat more sexually liberal attitudes than whites and have slightly more sex partners. But they also masturbate less frequently, have less oral sex, and slightly more likely to have same-sex contacts. On the other hand, age also affects sexuality. What turns us on at 50 will probably not be what turned us at 15. Not only are there significant psychological changes that augur a decline in sexual energy and interest, but age is also related to marital status and family obligations. In conclusion, gender differences persist in our sexual expression and our sexual experiences, but they are far less significant than they used to be, and the signs point to continued convergence. It may come as a relief to realize that our lovers are not from other planets, but are capable of the same joys and pleasures that we enjoy. That's the end of the topic about gender and desire. Again, I'm Jonalyn Lina and I'm from Marketing 3-1. I hope you enjoy and learn many things watching this video. Thank you for watching and listening until the end. Have a great day ahead.